The hall was thick with smoke and laughter, the kind of laughter that cuts sharper than a blade. At the far end, under lantern light, stood the bride no one dared to claim, a woman taller, stronger, and broader than most of the men who mocked her. Whispers called her cursed, unworthy, a spectacle rather than a bride. When a cowboy, urged forward by the crowd, shook his head and refused her, the saloon erupted in jeers that filled the night with cruelty. To them, her size was not strength but shame, and in that moment, she stood alone beneath a storm of scorn. Yet behind her silence burned a fire no insult could extinguish. She did not lower her head, nor beg for acceptance. Her eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the room with a dignity that unsettled those who laughed loudest. She was not made to fit into their narrow image of beauty or worth. She was carved by hardship, by a land that demanded resilience and gave little in return. And though they refused her, she carried herself as though rejection was not her end, but the beginning of something greater. The men who mocked her believed they had stripped her of value, but they had only revealed their own weakness. Their pride was loud, but shallow, built on the illusion of strength. She, on the other hand, carried the weight of silence like armor. Every sneer, every insult, became fuel for a fire that would blaze before dawn. The Old West was merciless, but it also respected one thing above all: courage. And she had it in her veins. That night, while others slept off their laughter, she proved them wrong. In the quiet hours, when the desert winds whispered through the camp, she rose from the ashes of humiliation, not with words of bitterness, but with deeds that no man could ignore. By morning, the same voices that had ridiculed her would be forced to admit what they had denied, that she had stood taller not because of her body, but because of her spirit. The cowboy who had refused her would awaken to a truth he never expected. He had turned away in scorn, but by sunrise, he and the rest would see her differently, not as the giant bride mocked by all, but as a woman who had risen above humiliation to claim something far more powerful than acceptance. She had earned respect, and in the Old West, respect was worth more than gold. When the jeers finally died down and the saloon doors swung shut behind her, the night air struck like a blade. The giant bride walked alone beneath the desert moon, her heart heavy but her back unbent. She had been humiliated before all, rejected not just by the man who turned from her, but by every sneer and whisper that followed. Yet each insult seemed to carve something sharper inside her, not despair, but resolve. In the silence of the night, she vowed that by morning they would see her differently. Her path led her beyond the edge of town, where the land stretched into shadows of rock and sand. The desert was cruel, but it had always been her teacher. She knew its whispers, its dangers, its hidden trials. While the cowboys laughed and filled their cups, she took up the work no one else dared. Her hands, strong and scarred, gathered wood, drew water, and prepared what others were too proud or too afraid to do. Each act was not for their approval, but for her own survival, and through survival, her worth would speak louder than any words. The memory of the cowboy's refusal still cut deep. His face had been firm, his voice clear when he turned her away. To the crowd, it had been entertainment, a cruel performance to confirm her unworthiness. But she replayed it differently in her mind. His rejection was not the end of her story. It was the fire that lit her determination. If he and the others could not see her worth in the saloon, then she would force them to see it where worth was proven, in the land, in the struggle, in the dawn. The desert tested her that night. Coyotes howled in the distance, the air turned cold enough to bite, and her body ached beneath its own weight. But she pressed forward, carrying loads heavier than most men would attempt. With each step, she built a strength that mocked their scorn. The night became her battlefield, and every obstacle conquered was a weapon sharpened for the morning. And as the first faint glow of dawn painted the horizon, her silhouette rose against the fire-lit sky. She had not been crushed by ridicule. She had risen above it, forged by the desert's cruelty into something unshakable. The sun had not yet fully climbed, but already the foundation of respect had been laid. By sunrise, the town stirred awake. The cowboys stumbled from their bunks, groggy from drink, expecting another day of routine and pride. Yet what they found waiting was not the same woman they had mocked the night before. She stood tall at the edge of the main street, her frame casting a long shadow that stretched across the dirt. Around her lay the fruits of her night's labor, wood stacked high, water barrels full, and game caught with her own hands. Tasks that had bested men twice her size were completed before the town had even risen. The whispers began almost immediately. Men rubbed their eyes, unsure if what they saw was real. Women murmured among themselves, their voices carrying awe instead of mockery. Children stared wide-eyed, pointing at the strength she displayed. The giant bride, once a figure of ridicule, now commanded silence through deeds alone. Respect was not begged for, it was earned, and in that morning light, she had earned more than any title could grant. The cowboy who had refused her stood among the onlookers, his jaw set, his pride rattled. He remembered her eyes when he turned her away, steady, unflinching, almost daring him to regret it. Now, as he looked at the proof of her endurance, he felt the sting of his own blindness. She had shown, in a single night, a strength that none of them possessed. His refusal, once celebrated, now burned as a mark of shame. The crowd did not laugh this time. Their silence was heavier than any ridicule, a silence filled with recognition. They could not erase what they had seen, nor could they dismiss it. The woman they had mocked had done what none of them had dared. And though no one yet spoke the word aloud, the truth lingered in every heart. She had earned respect. And as the sun rose higher, its light reflecting off her proud frame, it was clear that the story of the giant bride would not end in scorn. It had only just begun, and the Old West itself seemed to pause, ready to carry her legend across its vast and unforgiving land. The chief of the settlement arrived soon after, drawn by the hush that had fallen over the main street. He expected noise, the usual boasts of men too proud to admit their flaws, but instead he found silence wrapped around the figure of the woman they had mocked. Her shadow stretched far, her breath steady, her face fierce in the morning sun. The piles of wood, the full barrels, and the game she had carried back were not merely signs of labor. They were proof of a spirit that refused to be broken. He studied her carefully, his weathered eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in contemplation. The cowboys shifted uneasily under his gaze, their pride heavy in their throats. They had jeered at her size, called her unworthy, dismissed her as less than nothing. Now, with her achievements laid bare, their cruelty lay exposed. The chief spoke at last, his voice sharp enough to cut through their silence. "Last night you laughed at her. Tell me, who among you has done half of what she has done before the sun rose?" No one answered. Boots scuffed the dirt, hats dipped low, but not a single voice dared to rise. Their strength, once flaunted in ale-soaked bravado, seemed small compared to the work she had accomplished. They realized the truth in that moment. While they wasted their pride on laughter, she had carved respect out of stone. Their silence became her crown, a crown forged in the fire of humiliation and the steel of perseverance. The woman stood still, her chin high, her chest rising with the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove herself. She had endured more in one night than their words could ever weigh. The chief nodded slowly, and though his words were few, they sealed what everyone already knew. "Respect is not given," he said. "It is earned, and she has earned it." A murmur spread through the crowd, not of laughter but of acknowledgement. Eyes that once mocked now lingered with a reluctant admiration. Even the cowboy who had refused her felt the weight of those words press against his chest. She had risen above the scorn, not by begging for acceptance, but by standing unbroken until they could no longer deny her worth. That evening, the town gathered around the fire as they always did, but the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with curiosity, with whispers about what had unfolded that morning. Men who once led conversations sat quiet, their confidence shaken. And when the giant bride entered the circle, the silence deepened. She carried no shame in her steps, no fear in her posture. She entered not as the woman mocked in a saloon, but as one who had faced humiliation and turned it into triumph. The cowboy who had refused her could not keep his eyes from her. He remembered the sound of his own voice, the certainty with which he had dismissed her, and it now rang in his ears like a curse. Yet the more he watched her, the more he realized his mistake was not just in turning her away. It was in failing to see her. She had always been more than the crowd's laughter. He had simply been too blind, too proud, to recognize it. The chief spoke once more, his voice carrying over the crackling fire. In the Old West, respect is not won by beauty or by pride. It is won by endurance, by strength, by courage. Last night you mocked her. Today you witnessed what she carries. Let her stand as a reminder that greatness often wears the face of those we scorn. His words fell heavy, cutting deep into the hearts of those who had joined in the ridicule. Children leaned closer to their mothers, listening with wide eyes, while the men stared into the fire, their pride burning under the weight of the truth. The giant bride had shifted the story of their town forever. She was no longer just a woman rejected. She was a living legend of resilience. Her presence had forced them to look inward, to question the shallow laws of pride they had built their lives upon. And as the flames rose into the night sky, her shadow danced tall and unshaken against the light. She no longer needed their acceptance, for she had claimed something greater, respect born not from their voices, but from her own unyielding strength. The laughter of the night before was gone, replaced by a silence that spoke of reverence. The giant bride had risen, and with her rise, she had carved her place into the memory of the Old West. The days that followed carried a quiet shift across the town. Where once the giant bride had been the subject of laughter, now she walked through the streets under a silence that no one dared to break. Her presence commanded respect without demand, her eyes steady, her steps deliberate. She no longer belonged to their jokes. She belonged to their memory of the night they had mocked her, only to watch her rise above them all. That memory was heavier than their pride, and it followed her like a shadow. Women watched her with new eyes, whispering among themselves, not of shame but of admiration. They saw in her something rare, proof that strength could be carried with grace, that dignity could be claimed even when stripped of pride. Mothers told their daughters her story, warning them that the world would try to measure their worth in shallow ways, but reminding them that true worth is carved by courage and endurance. The tale of the giant bride became more than gossip. It became a lesson. The men, though slower to change, began to shift as well. Some still carried bitterness, unwilling to admit their failure, but even they avoided her gaze, knowing they could not erase what they had seen. Others found themselves humbled, reminded that their laughter had revealed more about themselves than it had about her. And though few spoke it aloud, many carried the sting of shame, realizing their cruelty had built the stage upon which her strength had shone. The cowboy who had refused her felt the weight of his choice more than anyone. Every time he saw her, he was confronted with the truth of his blindness. He had believed his rejection proved her unworthy, but instead it had proven him small. Each glance toward her was filled not with scorn, but with regret, and though he longed to undo his mistake, he knew he never could. His refusal had created her triumph, and that truth would follow him like a scar. And the woman herself, she did not seek revenge, nor did she carry bitterness. Her victory was not in shaming them, but in standing taller than their ridicule. She had no need to answer their past cruelty, for her life had already answered it louder than words. In every step, in every quiet glance, she carried the dignity she had earned, not given, not begged for, but forged in the fire of rejection. Her story began to spread beyond the town. Travelers carried whispers of the woman who had been mocked, rejected at a bride auction, and who, by the dawn, had earned the respect of all who saw her. In distant saloons, men argued whether it was truth or legend, while others swore they had been there to witness it themselves. The tale grew, not because of embellishment, but because it carried something that resonated deeply: the triumph of dignity over humiliation. In neighboring settlements, her name was spoken with reverence. Some called her foolish for enduring such scorn, but most admired the unshakable will that refused to crumble. She became a symbol, not just of strength, but of transformation. The idea that a woman once laughed at by an entire room could stand the next day with respect carved into her very shadow gave hope to those who had been silenced by shame. The chief himself saw the shift and understood what had been set in motion. He knew legends were not born in comfort, but in trial, and she had carried her trial with more courage than most men he commanded. By recognizing her worth, he had not merely lifted her, he had lifted the entire community, forcing them to confront the shallow cruelty that had governed them for too long. For the cowboy, however, the story was a wound that would not heal. His refusal had become the first chapter of a tale he no longer controlled. Where once his name had carried weight in the saloon, now was whispered with pity or disdain. He had been the man who turned away, who mocked what he could not see, who failed to recognize the strength standing before him. In her eyes, he had been diminished. But for her, there was no triumph in his regret. She did not need his acceptance, nor his apology. She had already moved beyond the night of rejection, beyond the sting of laughter. What mattered now was the respect she carried with her, not forced, not demanded, but undeniable. The Old West had watched her fall under ridicule and then rise higher than any insult could reach. And in that rise, she had carved her place in a legend. As the weeks passed, the weight of her story settled deeper into the bones of the town. The laughter that once defined her had vanished, replaced by a cautious reverence. People measured their words more carefully in her presence, aware that she had become something greater than their cruelty. She was no longer just a woman. They spoke of her as though she were a landmark of the desert itself, immovable, unshaken, and impossible to ignore. Around campfires, men retold the tale, their voices quieter than before, stripped of arrogance. Some admitted shame, confessing they had joined in the laughter because it was easier to mock than to stand alone in silence. Others tried to twist the story, claiming they had known she was strong all along, though the truth betrayed them. Whatever the version, the ending never changed. She had risen above them all. Children, curious and wide-eyed, began to follow her steps through town. They carried sticks on their shoulders, mimicking her strength, whispering about the night she turned humiliation into honor. To them, she was more than flesh and blood. She was a living lesson that even the most merciless scorn could not bury true dignity. She smiled at them softly, knowing that their small games would carry the seed of something greater in the years to come. The chief continued to honor her, his respect unshaken. He made it clear in every word and gesture that the community owed her more than silence. They owed her a lesson learned. Under his authority, her place in the tribe was sealed, and though not every man liked it, none dared to challenge it. For to challenge her now was to challenge the chief himself, and by extension, the truth that had already been carved into the dust. The cowboy who had once refused her avoided her gaze whenever their paths crossed. His swagger was gone, his pride broken beneath the weight of a mistake the whole town remembered. And though she bore no grudge, his shame deepened every time he saw her standing taller than the night he had tried to make her small. His silence, once powerful, had become the echo of his failure. Over time, her strength grew into legend far beyond the town. Strangers who had never seen her spoke of her with reverence, repeating the tale of the giant bride who had been scorned, only to rise into respect that no man could deny. In the vast Old West, where cruelty often carved men into stone, her story became a reminder that dignity could not be bought, stolen, or mocked into dust. It had to be lived, and she had lived it. Her presence became a quiet test for others. When new faces arrived, they would hear the story before meeting her. Some came expecting a figure broken by shame, others imagining a monster twisted by anger. But when they saw her, calm, steady, eyes carrying both the weight of scars and the fire of resilience, they understood. She was not defined by the jeers of men, but by the grace with which she had outlasted them. The women of neighboring towns whispered her name as both warning and encouragement. They told their daughters, "Do not let the world decide your worth," pointing to her as proof. She had become something the Old West rarely offered, a beacon for those who lived in silence under the weight of ridicule. Through her, they believed that humiliation could be endured and turned into strength. The cowboy who had refused her faded into obscurity. His name, once spoken with pride, became a footnote in her story. He was remembered not for his victories, but for the mistake that revealed her greatness. And though bitterness consumed him, it only amplified her legend. The world did not remember his refusal, it remembered her rise. And so, around fires and across deserts, her tale lived on. The Old West, built on pride and hardened by cruelty, had bowed before something greater. The courage of a woman who carried her scars as proof of survival, and who rose from scorn to claim the one treasure no ridicule could steal: respect. The years rolled forward, but her story never faded. What began as whispers in dusty saloons grew into a tale, told across vast plains and over campfires beneath star-strewn skies. She was no longer spoken of as the giant bride, in mockery, but in reverence, as the woman who turned shame into triumph. Her name carried the weight of a lesson. That laughter aimed to wound often reveals more weakness in the mocker than in the one mocked. She herself lived quietly, never boasting of what she had endured. Her strength was not loud, nor did it seek applause. It was steady, carried in her work, in the way she met every stare without flinching, in the silence that reminded people that respect was not taken by force but earned through living truth. The more she stayed grounded, the taller her legend grew. The Old West respected survival, and she embodied it without needing to raise a weapon. Generations began to take hold of the story. Children who had once whispered her name in games grew older, carrying her example into their own lives. Some became mothers who reminded their daughters that worth was never measured in the eyes of men, and others became fathers who told their sons that mocking another's scars was the act of a coward. Her story, passed down, reshaped the way people thought of strength itself. The chief, though weathered with age, never ceased to honor her place. He spoke often of the night when the town had failed her, and the morning when she had silenced them all. "We thought we saw a weakness," he would say, "but it was we who were weak. She showed us what it means to endure." His words carried the truth that her victory was not simply hers. It had been a rebirth for the entire community. And for the cowboy who had turned her away, the years were less kind. His name was never spoken with admiration again. When his story was told, it was always in her shadow, remembered only as the one who refused to see what was standing in front of him. His silence had once been pride, but in history, it became a scar. By the time gray touched her hair, the giant bride was no longer remembered for the ridicule she endured, but for the dignity she claimed. Her story had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, told in the same breath as other legends of the Old West. Yet hers was different. It was not about violence or conquest, but about resilience and transformation. She had proven that respect was not granted by mockers, nor stolen by laughter. It was born in the fire of endurance and in the choice to rise when others tried to bury you. On her final days, she often sat by the fire, her shadow stretching long across the ground, the same way it had that first morning when the town fell silent. People came to her not out of pity, but to seek wisdom. She told them little, only that life was not about avoiding scorn but about enduring it, for only then could one discover the strength buried within. Her quiet words carried more power than the loudest boasts of men who had once mocked her. Long after she was gone, the story endured. It was told in saloons, in family circles, and in quiet whispers across the land. She was mocked by all, they would say, but she rose above it, and in the end, she earned respect. And each retelling carried the same weight it had on that first dawn. The reminder that humiliation is not the end of the story, but often the soil where dignity takes root. The cowboy's name was lost to history, his pride swallowed by time, but hers lived on, carried by those who found courage in her defiance. Her legend was a warning to the cruel and a beacon to the broken. In a world that respected only survival, she had proven that survival with dignity was the greatest triumph of all. Thus, the Old West remembered her not as the bride rejected, but as the woman who turned scorn into silence, and silence into respect. And with every retelling, the fire of her story burned anew, teaching generation after generation that true strength is not measured by what the world calls you, but by how you rise when it tries to break you. Her story stands as one of the rarest legacies of the Old West, not a tale of gunfights or gold, but of a woman who refused to let the world's laughter define her. She was mocked, humiliated, and cast aside, yet she turned rejection into the very fire that carried her higher than those who ridiculed her. Her triumph was not in silencing their voices, but in living so strongly that their scorn crumbled into irrelevance. That is why, long after the dust of those days settled, Her name endured when theirs did not. Her journey reminds us that dignity is never given by a crowd. It is claimed in the quiet strength of standing unbroken. Every insult hurled at her became fuel. Every rejection another stone upon which she built her unshakable presence. And by sunrise, the same voices that mocked her bowed to the undeniable truth. Respect is not handed down by the powerful. It is earned by those who refuse to yield. The cowboy who once turned her away vanished into obscurity, remembered only as the shadow at the edge of her story. Yet her name spread beyond deserts and plains, because she had done what few ever dared. She rose above humiliation without letting bitterness poison her. Her victory was not against the men who mocked her, but against the silence that could have broken her spirit. She proved that the greatest triumph is not in revenge, but in resilience. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all is this: life will test you with rejection, with laughter, with the sting of not being chosen. But if you endure, if you stand with your head held high, you may discover that those very trials are what carve the respect you were always meant to carry. True strength does not come from avoiding scorn, but from rising so completely that scorn loses its power. If this story moved you, let its lesson live beyond these words. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep walking with us through these unforgettable tales. Leave a like if her resilience inspired you, and share in the comments how this story speaks to your own journey. Together, we keep alive the voices of those who remind us that even in the harshest lands, dignity can rise from the dust and shine brighter than gold.